The show marks an experimental milestone along the 3-year journey I've been on now with trying to understand the story. I talk about some of its beginnings with photography in the audio essay that plays in the gallery. I'd like to begin my talk tonight by reading that short piece in English. "BINNEGOED, colored and South African photography, was inspired by an encounter identical to the one Toni Morrison describes in the epigraph to her novel Home. Like Morrison's character, I too entered a house I had never been in before, and once I entered it, was overcome by a strange sense of belonging. I knew every room. I knew that close by the living room door, there would be a rectangular barred window that looked out onto the street. I knew that the living room would have a narrow doorway to a short passage that to my right would lead to a small kitchen and to my left to 2 bedrooms. I knew that between 1 bedroom and the kitchen was a little bathroom. Its door I knew would be closed as the only private space visible from either outside the front door or from the settee against the wall under the rectangular window. I even knew that the focus of the living room pointed to the wall farthest from the front door, on the side where the television and the biggest cabinet of memorabilia stood. This was a familiar feeling I felt inside an unfamiliar house. A felt memory like this came over me again upon uncovering this photograph from its archival box. Utterly unique among other images in the collections I saw, the photograph framed an intimate look of an unknown woman in a dark housecoat with hands resting in her lap. The photographer who made the image was Anne Fisher, who also recorded life before Apartheid in the small rural community of Genadendal. Originally known as Baviaanskloof, Genadendal was South Africa's first mission station, established in 1738. Its historical significance for the country is recognized in the name of the official residence of South Africa's president, which Nelson Mandela renamed Genadendal in 1994. I knew about Genadendal, which means Valley of Grace, from my mother, who grew up in an even smaller town nearby. She showed me an old family photograph of my great-great-grandmother, who worked as a midwife in Genadendal. As far as I understand, this is the only known image left of her. My extended family believes it commemorates a celebration of her 90th birthday. Her name was Maria Africa, and she lived to the age of 102. My family photograph and the archival image of the unknown woman who Anne met are connected because of Genadendal, a place much like the archive, a place of long histories, ordinary and important, private and public, big and small. In search of these nested pasts, I set off by remembering photographs of graceful gestures in familiar housecoats. For the last 10 months here at the Center for Documentary Studies, I've been under the tutelage of exhibitions director Courtney Reed-Eaton. With 25 years of experience in exhibition making, Courtney is the reason why BINNEGOED now lives, if only for a short while, as a collective experience rather than a set of complicated ideas in my head. I don't know why this slideshow is not playing either. What a magical thing exhibition making is. But boy, what a collective effort it takes. But I was in safe hands, thanked wholeheartedly at the end of the guide you can find at the entrance to the gallery. I want to take this moment to thank them all again for also teaching me. Thanking Courtney extends to being grateful for their grace, wicked humor, and hard work in making BINNEGOED possible. Courtney Reed-Eaton, a labyrinthian woman who has taught me many things, but most of all has let me in on the strange alchemy of transforming ideas into encounters with language, imagery, and design in space. The installation is because of her. She has an acute spatial consciousness. By the way, something I've come to love about New Yorkers. And she knows what's possible. But really, she understands how to take ideas and make them into things. And even though I knew nothing, Courtney was always patient and took the time to teach me the basics, like how to load a staple gun. I kid you not. How to do math with Post-its. But really, how not to be afraid to measure, hammer, and try again. My writing also is because of her. Actually, because of that look she'd give me when I'd agonize over the text and she'd say, really? It was very important to me that the writing be historically accurate, that it could hold the breadth of history necessary to understand the sentiment of Eugene Paramour, which really is the heart of the story. But these things aren't why Courtney would give me that look. Honestly, I wasn't comfortable with her feedback on my final draft. After reading it, she insisted I do two things. One, make my writing less academic. And two, bring myself into the story. And when I tell her about my irrational fears of using the word I, she'd give me that look. So off I'd have to go, heavy with the burden of having to self-disclose. But in the end, she was right. Using the word I was helpful in making my writing human. So thank you, Courtney, for being a beloved footnote slayer. But really for helping me be brave. I could not have done this without you. I can see that look now in my mind's eye as I say, excuse the schmaltz. But I feel a little exposed, which is something I, as a maker of documentary, wanting to tell stories about invisible people, has never really had to contend with before. Being as willing and able to expose myself to the same extent as I am willing and able to expose the stories of others can be a hell of a thing. Yo. Creating dangerously. That's how Ruth Behar described her work as a creative scholar recently at a lecture she gave at CDS. Now spend enough time here and you'll encounter Ruth's work, which is part of the ether at CDS. Now I should admit that I had never heard of her before. But attending her talk was one of the many small miracles that unfolded for me during the process of creating the show. She came at a moment when I needed to be reminded of what this was all about. She said many things that went over my head, but I did write down 3 important words: vulnerability, heartbreak, and failure. 3 lessons of bin-ne-goed that came to humble me these last few months. Ruth also quoted someone else in one of her iconic works who said that what happens within the observer must be known if the nature of what has been observed is to be understood. This is a question of vulnerability I take with me along my path to see bin-ne-goed to its ultimate end. I'm still trying to make sense of the ways in which this collective story folds into my own. I hope I remain curious about the aspects of myself I don't reveal. And think about what can this that remains unspoken say about South Africa. And this is the part of heartbreak, the part about South Africa, the home of my vulnerability and the vulnerability of the community classified as colored. Dis die story van Afrikaans. Now, Afrikaans made its way into bin-ne-goed surreptitiously. I gave the show an Afrikaans title. I had flirted with some other ideas that just didn't go deep enough, and I couldn't find an English word or phrase that encapsulated the idea for the show, but also retained the subversive humor that so-called colored people are known for. Julle weet ons breinmense is vol gesegdes. Courtney suggested I create the audio essay and that it be in Afrikaans. Another thing I dreaded, for which she gave me that look. And Afrikaans also ended up solving a writing challenge. It became a connection I could make between my story and the story I wanted to tell of apartheid memory. I, like many others, refer to Afrikaans as the language of the oppressor. And Afrikaans was the language of the apartheid state. Its political oppression on South Africa was the reason young people rose up in the 1976 Soweto uprisings, which marked the beginnings of the end of apartheid. But I made reference to the language in this way to question a monolithic understanding of apartheid, because Afrikaans was not only the language of Afrikaner nationalism. The origins of the language are not simply European, but stem from their fatal intimacies with slave and Khoisan communities who were classified as colored. Is that in the end, these Asiatic and first indigenous communities, who having had already lost so much, also lost official claim to their language. And Afrikaans became the very language through which they had to speak of, learn about, and answer to their own oppression. So Afrikaans, as bin-ne-goed would have it, is inextricable from South Africa through the lens of colored. Now here comes the failure. What do I mean when I say through the lens of colored in South Africa? Is colored simply a category of race? Does it describe a community? How do people identify as colored in a South Africa where new meanings of colored are still emerging? I don't know. Colored can be a very slippery thing because of its contradictions, which I've come to know as very South African. So tonight is really a celebration of what it means to be South African, at a time when South Africans are struggling to reconcile our histories of paradox that live deep within our contemporary condition. And these histories of paradox are wide and long. Like Afrikaans as the language of both power and powerlessness. Like the histories of violence, missionary evangelicism, even race consciousness that both caused our suffering but also freed us. Colored as one means through which to get at this thing of South African paradox is my next frontier. Because as local writer Njabula Ndebele says, for many in South Africa, the political identity has overdetermined the potential of our multiple groundedness. Ndebele is trying to make a case for a climate of identity that is one of multiplicity, which he believes, and I agree, is one vital ingredient for a more robust politics. Ndebele writes that this would signal a move away from the blunt instrument of the politics of the single choice. How do we as South Africans move away from our singular politics that was necessary to overthrow the singular system that was apartheid? How do we create identities of many things? I don't know. But as a South African learning about colored, I'm beginning to see the importance of understanding colored as a way into this question. Because colored always has been many things. Colored has always had to be a kind of shape-shifting force of culture and politics throughout our history. And so, the small colored stories of this kind of multiple groundedness, pictured in the photographs you've seen tonight, represents the kind of South Africa I'd like to remember and the kind of South African future I'd like to celebrate. Dankie.